very good afternoon to all of you. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Ambassador and Professor Jitendranath Mishra to the Institute of South Asian Studies to deliver a talk on a somewhat neglected topic, namely the India-Vietnam relationship. For some of us who were school kids in the 1970s, actually I was quite very young in the 70s, the defining image of Vietnam was, of course, the Vietnam War. This was especially so in communist ruled West Bengal, where I spent my school and college years, where chants of Amannam, Tomannam, Shobannam, Vietnam, which roughly translates into my name, your name, everybody's name is Vietnam, was actually quite common. Indeed, the war, which formally ended in 1975, has cast and still continues to cast, one could argue, a long shadow over Vietnam's modern history. In fact, I was there, just my first visit to Vietnam recently, early this year, and I visited the War Remnants Museum, which occupies a prominent place in the city. And I was quite struck to see a Communist Party of India Marxist CPIM poster on display, which said Ho Chi Minh Lal Salam, which means red salute to Ho Chi Minh. Of course, much has changed in Vietnam since the decades that the war ended, as has the relationship between India and Vietnam, which was arguably bound initially in the early years by anti-colonial sentiments and third world solidarity. Vietnam's ties with India are, of course, the subject of today's seminar by Ambassador Mishra. The seminar draws upon the speaker's time in India as India's Consul General in Ho Chi Minh City between 2006 and 2010, as well as from primary sources, secondary sources, interviews and discussions during his 8 visits to Vietnam between 2011 and 2023. You all have Ambassador Mishra's long and very distinguished CV, so I won't go over it in detail, but very briefly, he holds a PhD from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, or JNU in New Delhi, and is a retired Indian diplomat, having served as the ambassador in Portugal and Laos and consul general in Ho Chi Minh City. He's professor of diplomatic practice at the School of International Affairs at the OP Jindal Global University in India. He has published and spoken widely on international affairs, both in academic outlets, as well as in popular newspapers, magazines, and channels. He also, interestingly, has a keen interest in the history of sports, and especially field hockey, which is a passion I share, having myself written a social history of Indian sport called Nation at Play. So I'm really looking forward to his forthcoming book, which I believe is titled The Sport of Pace and Grace, a biography of field hockey. So the floor is yours, Ambassador Mishra. Perhaps you could speak between 30 to 40 minutes, leaving some time for question answers.
Fine.
Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ranajay Sen, for that generous introduction. And you really warmed me by talking about our beloved common interest of field hockey and sport. And I am very intrigued by the book that you have written on sport. And I'm going to lay my hands on it with alacrity, and I'm going to read it soon and look forward to it. And that's another common interest. I would like to say that I'm here visiting my daughter, my nephew is here, Pinaki, and to see my grandchild. And Dr. Iqbal Singh Savia was very kind to say, why don't you give a talk? And I grabbed the opportunity with both hands, because this is a very distinguished forum, a very world-class, well-known university globally, earning a great deal of respect for its scholastic and other attributes, and its students, world-class. So it's a great honor to be here. I would like to thank Mr. Jordan Ang also, who has put all this together in terms of the logistics. And greetings from India. And now I begin my talk with a response to your comment, Ho Chi Minh Lal Salam. Amar Nam, Tomar Nam, Ho Chi Minh. Shaban Nam, Ho Chi Minh. Our name, your name, everybody's name, Ho Chi Minh. Now, there is a street called it was called Shakespeare Sarani. What an irony. It was then renamed Ho Chi Minh Sarani, Ho Chi Minh Street. From Shakespeare to Ho Chi Minh, from the most distinguished literary icon of England to the most distinguished political icon of Vietnam. That was the kind of hold that Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh had in the Indian imagination in the 1950s and 60s, certainly. So Vietnam holds, I think even holds today and held then a very special place in the Indian scheme of things, whether it was officially, whether it was through the fraternal ties with communist groups and people at large, through the leadership of India, of course, because Jawaharlal Nehru was an iconic figure. And if he liked Ho Chi Minh, then Indians liked Ho Chi Minh because Indians loved Nehru. So, by association, everybody loved Ho Chi Minh and Vietnam. Now, let me tell you what is happening today. And I'm not going to speak about the history at all, because a lot of you probably don't have a very clear idea of Indo-Vietnam ties. I'm going to speak from an entirely realist prism in terms of what I observe, and I'm going to attempt, I'm not going to be very diplomatic because I'm a scholar now. I can say what I want, but things have changed. I'll give you an example. I start with an example. When I was Consul General in Ho Chi Minh City, Mr. Bikash Ranjan Bhattacharya, who is the CPI card-holding member, who is now a member of Parliament, Upper House Rajya Sabha in India, he was the mayor of Kolkata. He brought a huge delegation to Ho Chi Minh City. So I held a reception in my house, and he asked me, I'm going to meet Le Hong Kwan. Le Hong Kwan was the chairman of the People's Committee of Ho Chi Minh City and the mayor, and one of the 8 Politburo members of the Vietnam Communist Party. So he was a very powerful man, holding 3 ranks. So the mayor and the chairman of the People's Committee hosts even presidents, visiting presidents of countries when they come to Ho Chi Minh City. So he was the official host. So he asked me, what should I talk about? I said, talk about current things. Talk about changing Vietnam, changing India. He says, I want to talk about the Vietnam War. I said, please don't talk about it. They don't want to talk about it. My request is don't do it because they almost feel awkward having to talk down the Americans, given the kind of rapprochement that's being attempted here in Vietnam with the Americans. So I told him that. He just listened and he didn't say yes, he didn't say no. And sure enough, he raised that. You fought the Americans, you did this and you did that. You are the most heroic people in the world. The sort of narrative that we hear very often, particularly among communists, but among others also in India, even today. So he started talking like that. So Leung Kwan listened to him very politely. He says, how could you welcome George Bush for the APEC summit? He was wearing Vietnamese clothes, and how could you give him such a warm welcome? So Mr. Le Hong Kwan said, Mr. Mayor, he was our honored guest, and Vietnamese culture always honors its guests. And then he said, okay, but the Americans did this and that. Then he says, in response, he smiles, he says, Mr. Mayor, things have changed. We have no ill will against the American people. And history is history. We can't forget our history. But we have to move on. And we want to build a different kind of relationship with the Americans. So that's what Vietnam was in 2006. Now that has significantly gone a few steps further towards, I think, greater understanding with the Americans and with the world, which is not communist and which is not ideologically defined. So now I come to the substance of my talk, having made that opening remark about India. Now, what's happening in ties with India? I begin with culture because culture interests me greatly, and culture is one of the most underappreciated, undervalued things in discussion of foreign affairs. I'm not talking about soft power and cultural diplomacy. Soft power by itself doesn't really give you the benefits and the dividends and the results. It has to be backed by the boots and by the hard power. I'm not talking about the cultural diplomacy of governments, but I'm talking about deeply held cultural beliefs and history. Now, you know, in India, people talk about the Champa. You must have heard about the Champa civilization of Vietnam, which was a great civilization, an Indianized, Hinduized civilization. Now, there is an amiable history. It's not a complicated history like Vietnam and China, for example. Very amiable history of migration from India in the first millennium. We know about that. Indian culture reached Vietnam in, you know, I hear this benign and peaceful waves. Lê Thi Hang Na, my dear friend from the Vietnam Institute for Indian and Southwest Asian Studies, coined this phrase, along with Rina Marwa. They wrote a lovely book recently on Indo-Vietnam ties, which I reviewed also recently. They said benign and peaceful. That means not much. China is forceful and potent, marching forward and overwhelming us. So India is not perceived as a threat, nor is it even concerning. That's the first thing to remember about the way Vietnamese view India. You could even argue that, does it matter that much? I think it does to some extent, but we'll have to bring China into this discussion, because everything that you talk about when it concerns Vietnam, China has to be there. In fact, China has to be there in everything we talk about the rest of the world today. Without China, there's no discussion, because it is the preeminent rising power that's become a superpower now. So Vietnamese love to write revisionist histories about China, but in a very delicate way. The song of Kiao, by this great poetry. For example, it is Chinese, but it's also not Chinese. It's a very complicated attitude. But with India, there is no need to write such revisionist histories. And they do recognize that the Hinduized Champas are a part of Vietnamese culture. Even though the Champas were intruders. They were intruders. So if you talk to the Vietnamese, they have very complex attitudes towards the Champa. Now, by the 17th century, these Champa people, the Champa civilization, between the 4th and 17th centuries, it reached its peak in the say 1000, 800, 900, 1000 AD. Then it starts declining, and then it becomes a very tiny community of 161,729 people. It's slowly strangulated by the march of the kin people. The Vietnamese are the kin, ethnic kin from the north, from the Red River Valley. And the Vietnamese narrative is that civilization begins in the Red River Valley and moves south. And that's also because of the southward push of the Chinese, who pushed the kin, who pushed the Champa down south. So it's interesting, even if the Champas are regarded as foreigners, they are also regarded as Vietnamese, because they also repelled Chinese intruders in the 6th century. So they are also part of the nationalist narrative of struggle against China, which is the real identifier. It is the real marker of Vietnamese history as a struggle against China. Cooperate and struggle. That's the phrase they all use. We cooperate and struggle with China. So a non-threatening Champa becomes an elite level link to balance China's impact. As I said, it's politically acceptable. Vietnam acknowledges the civilization diffused from India to Vietnam, not the other way around. They're comfortable with the idea that high civilization also came from India, but they're not comfortable with the idea of that coming from China, because it overwhelmed them. It signified the Vietnamese people. So for India, it's very convenient, because collaboration in preservation of Champa monument, this is my own theory, I've not read it anywhere, The preservation of Champa monuments is a project of the Indian government today. So that is something that the Indian government loves to do because it radiates India's cultural influence and perhaps reconnects India in some way to the Vietnam and Southeast Asia by extension of the first millennium. So the French culture cannot be a symbol of this kind of collaboration because the French are also seen as immediate and recent intruders, colonialists. So under a 2014 MOU on conservation and restoration of the Mission World Heritage Site, the Archaeological Survey of India has carried out a whole lot of preservation work in the Cham temples. And they have completed some of them, 3 projects in December last year. But is history enough? I'm talking about history and culture, but is it enough? Does it give enough force to a modern relationship? I don't think so. It can be only a foundation, a part of a foundation, but not the entire thing. Because severance of contacts during colonial rule, that means when India was colonized, first the Islamic invasions, definitely, and then the Western invasions of India meant that the movement of people, ideas, philosophy, culture to and fro between India and Southeast Asia slowed down, trade slowed down, and virtually came to a stop. By the 18th or 19th century, there wasn't much happening, except that served British interests, but not served Indian interests. It was happening, but it was done by the British for their own interests. So not independently and indigenously. That's what I meant. So it wasn't happening. India was focused westward. So because of that, that link was broken, and it's, as I said, through archaeology and through cooperation, monuments, preservation, all that is being renewed. Those kinds of links are being renewed in some way. Then there are also different cultural practices why I feel that culture cannot be the basis of the relationship. Vietnamese visitors are shocked, literally shocked at the minuscule Buddhist community in India. Vietnamese go to India as the Holy Land. The majority are Buddhists, and Buddhism is accepted, well accepted, and the practice of Buddhism is allowed, of course. So they go to India, and then they see that there are no Buddhists in India, and they're shocked. They have a kind of idea of India as a holy Buddhist land where Buddhism thrives. But ordinary people don't understand that Buddhism was decimated perhaps in India 1,000 years ago after the revival, Shankaracharya and all these things. So the other thing is that Indians do not understand the signification of Vietnam, how deep the signification of Vietnam has become over after 1,000 years of Chinese occupation in the first millennium. In fact, the Vietnamese think in a very similar way, and many Vietnamese have Chinese blood, and there are Chinese Vietnamese also, but they are, of course, Vietnamese, not Chinese. So the scholars Thi Oan Nguyen and Thuy Nguyen Pham allude to differences in culture, customs, language, political institutions, and national development strategies. National development strategies, I'm not so sure about. I think they're quite similar today, but definitely political culture is different, but I don't think that's significant. But culture, if you read the joint statements between India and Vietnam, we talk about a shared history, shared culture, common culture. It's not the case. It's much more complicated. Travel is just 31,400 Vietnamese visited India in 2018. And in 2022, after the introduction of new flights, there are plenty of flights now, 82,000 between January and October 2022, 82,000 Indians visited Vietnam. But that's not a great number. I think it's in a couple of 100,000 a year now, Indian visitors, which is also not very significant. But even if there are these limitations, Vietnam still perseveres with the use of Indian culture as a balancer, as a strategic balancer against the overwhelming impact of Chinese culture. Vietnam was historically divided. My view is that it was historically divided into a Sinicized zone from the north up to the city of Hue, which is like the Forbidden City. It's constructed like the Forbidden City of Beijing. And then from that region, Hoi An, Da Nang, Hue, southwards is the Indic culture, the Champas. Mostly along the coast and the low mountains near the coast, but not in the highland, not in the western highlands of Vietnam. There was no clash of civilizations, not the Huntington type of clash of civilization. It was all seamless. It was one culture blending into another, but there were two cultural zones broadly overlapping, but there was a putative China-India rivalry that might have emerged amid unaware protagonists. Neither the Chinese nor the Indians nor the Vietnamese understood it, that there was a competition, some kind of rivalry, but it must have been there in some way. But that's because there was no modern nation state. And the modern nation state and the identity markers that go with it are something Westphalian after the reorganization of Europe. So unlike China, India does not confront Vietnam with any kind of cultural coercion. That's something very important to understand. So Vietnam uses the link with India to serve its China-wary identity politics and to bolster the legitimacy of the state. We are Vietnamese, we are different, we are nationalistic, we are patriotic, and we have a history of struggle, but also a history of cooperation with China, that kind of thing. So why am I talking so much about China when discussing India? Because the whole argument that I have developed for this talk is that China comes very much into the picture when we discuss India-Vietnam ties in some way or the other. Now, according to the 2023 ISAS Yusuf Ishaq Institute, the same poll, 33.1% of Vietnamese were confident that India would do the right thing to contribute to global peace, security, prosperity, and governance, and only 3.7% held such confidence in China. 10.9% of Vietnamese expressed admiration for India's civilization and culture, only 2.9% for China. That's the point I was trying to make, that in public perceptions, Indian culture is far more acceptable than Chinese culture. It doesn't matter as far as relationships are concerned, but that's the perception among the people. A Pew survey in 2015 found that 66% of Vietnamese viewed India favorably, only 19% viewed China favorably. 56% had confidence that Prime Minister Narendra Modi would do the right thing regarding world affairs. Only 20% had held such confidence in President Xi Jinping. So that's how it works at the popular level. Now, our president, President Ram Nath Kovind in 2018 was given the honor of addressing the Vietnam National Assembly, the second person after President Xi Jinping, the second head of state or government to be given that honor. But this doesn't mean that India and China are equal in Vietnam, far from it. There is no equivalence, because wanting India to do more, they want India to do more for Vietnam, is very different from India actually doing more for Vietnam. And I'll come to the structural problems now in the relationship. Because China actually does more, whereas Vietnamese hope that India would do more, but India actually doesn't. So, for example, in the same poll of the Yusuf Ishaq Institute, 38.3% of Vietnamese felt that India lacks the capacity or political will for global leadership, whereas only 4.3% had such doubts about China's capacity for global leadership. So China is seen as a much more capable power than India. So similarly, when we talk of economic ties, let's just use some figures. just to illustrate the point that India really does not figure very high in Vietnam's. Vietnam would want India to do more, as I said, but in reality, India actually does much less. Let's talk economics. Vietnam's trade with India is only 14.40 billion US dollars in 2022 Indian financial year figures. China is 9 times higher in 2020 at 133 million, 14.4 billion versus 133 billion a year earlier. China's share of Vietnam's trade was 20.04% in 2017. In contrast, in 2019-20, Vietnam took only 1.61% of India's exports, while India's share of Vietnam's imports was less than 1%. So you can see we are talking of a difference of 20% and 1%. A gap. That's a kind of huge gap. As of early 2022, India ranked only 25th among investors in Vietnam, with cumulative investments of US dollars 1.9 billion. Now here's the figure for China. In 2019, China accounted for 27.5% of total registered capital, and in 2020 alone, and that too up to the month of November, China invested $2.4 billion in 1 year, less than 1 year, whereas India's cumulative investment over all these years is only $1.9 billion. So you are seeing a huge difference. These figures are very stark and very revealing about the actual state of this relationship, as opposed to what the governments try to project it as. India, for example, failed to supply the Covishield vaccine to Vietnam that had been approved in January 2021. And there are people on records telling me that they all preferred the Covishield vaccine, but they had to take China's Sinopharm vaccine because India had the second wave, the devastating second wave of the epidemic, and they had to turn to China. But they did not trust the Chinese vaccine as much as they trusted the Indian vaccine, but India was not able to make the supply. 16% of these of the respondents in the 2022, a year earlier, because this year there was no COVID survey by the Yusuf Ishaq Institute, but the previous year, to a 20.16%, Vietnamese respondents said China had provided the most COVID-19 support to the region, whereas only 0.7% said India had provided such support. So these are perceptions, and I suspect the perceptions in other countries, with great respect to my own country, of course, but I must try to face the truth. I suspect this is also the perception in other countries in Southeast Asia about India's delivery on during the COVID-19 epidemic. Forget China. As I was telling Dr. Ranjay Sen a little while ago, Vietnam has moved ahead of India. So the question is, today Vietnam's per capita GDP is 3,756 US dollars, according to the World Bank, 2021. And India's 2,256.60. So there's a huge gap, almost 80% more than India's per capita GDP. So I ask myself the question, in the heart of hearts, are the Vietnamese willing to accept the kind of wisdom from India they were willing to do in the first millennium? They might be thinking we are ahead of India, and they are. When I go to Vietnam today, I travel a lot there. I speak Vietnamese also. Now, when I go there, I see a tremendous prosperity. Of course, it's not like Singapore. It's not like even Indonesia or Malaysia or Thailand, but they're getting there. They're upward bound economically very rapidly, and India is improving, but then India is huge, and the improvement is slow and not as starkly visible as in the case of Vietnam. So therefore, because the Chinese influence is so strong and overwhelming, my argument is that do the Vietnamese give joy to us? All relationships have to be pragmatic. They have to be based on a mutuality of interests and a mutuality in delivery on those interests. But does Vietnam deliver? I don't think so. For example, we have a border crisis still raging, very much alive, standoff between China and India, in not just in Ladakh, now in Arunachal Pradesh, in the eastern sector, even in the central sector. And when this crisis broke in 2020, during the COVID epidemic, Vietnam has never taken a position on that. For example, there was barely any mention. Professor Rina Marwa and Leti Hangya, who wrote that book, they interviewed a lot of people. There was barely any mention in the media of this crisis, let alone support for India or even any kind of commentary. And my own research yields more complex attitudes. Most other researchers I spoke to were reluctant to even discuss this topic when I tried to discuss it. So what happens is that they are completely opaque. They don't want to offend China in any way. The government of Vietnam today encourages the Vietnamese media, literally encourages to voice concerns about Chinese aggressive behavior in the South China Sea. It wasn't public when I was there. It was not allowed even. But today it's public. Now that is because the government feels that by doing that, they are allowing people to vent their feelings, and therefore the legitimacy of the state is reinforced, because the government, by allowing the people to express their feelings, have the support of the people, and they rally the people then behind them on the South China Sea dispute. And it's all over the media in Vietnam. Everybody speaks about it openly, but nobody will ever speak on India's concerns with regard to China, because Chinese power is so overwhelming right now. And as one scholar whom I won't name said, we have too much economic dependency on China. China can attack Vietnam anytime, quote unquote. I was just told by a scholar, anytime. I said, are you sure? They have already occupied the islands. So, fait accompli, it's a done deal. Nobody resisted. They've got what they want. They said, but there are all kinds of pressure against us. And there is also lack of any kind of confidence in the leadership, interestingly, in Vietnam. They think the general secretary is too old and the party is not doing enough, and the party is more interested in preserving party-to-party links with China than dealing with the feelings and the sentiments and the interests of the country and the sentiments of the people. That's a feeling that I got from many Vietnamese, but this is private. I can't name those people since this talk is going to go in the public domain. But that's how it is. So there are many strands of opinion in that country. So therefore, Vietnamese, what do they ask India? What should India do? They want India to do more. So Huynh Tam Sang asked India to deploy its navy in the South China Sea to deter China, but he will not talk about the Sino-Indian border standoff, or even about terrorism, cross-border terrorism, or about Kashmir. I have never seen a statement from the Vietnamese government of support for India on any of these issues. I have never seen it. Nothing. They do give us the support, which I think is ritualistic, on India's aspiration to become a permanent member of the UN Security Council, but so do the Americans, so do the Russians, so does everybody else except the Chinese. They'll never say it. They strongly oppose it, and they're very clear about it. But saying that in a joint statement really is meaningless, because the negotiation has to happen on the floor of the UN after the UN ambassador of that country makes a formal statement, and it becomes part of the official documents. Then only will it have any credibility, and no UN ambassador has made that statement. So Vietnam gives that kind of pro forma support on issues on which it doesn't cost anything, but not on issues of paramount importance to India. So now, the VN Express newspaper discussing collaboration between Vietnam and India to build 12 high-speed patrol vessels, which India has delivered, by the way. And that's another example of good delivery, timely delivery, last year. Says it is to strengthen security, detect illegal activities like smuggling, and assist search and rescue. No mention of China. So they are very, very careful. Now, the external balancing in the South China Sea, which would be of some interest to you here, because it is of great interest to everybody in Southeast Asia and to us. Vietnam's responses to Chinese aggressive behavior in the South China Sea has been to engage. Vietnam has not confronted, the Chinese have confronted the oil rig incident of 2014, and routinely Chinese the militia, the civil militia, the fishermen and others, and patrol vessels, coast guards, they go into Vietnam's exclusive economic zone, and Vietnam is either unable or unwilling or both to physically resist it. It's happening all the time. There was an incident just a few weeks ago, for example, and I think the Chinese ships withdrew after some time. But no other country is willing to come to Vietnam's aid. The Americans show freedom of freedom of navigation operations but in the areas claimed by China, the so-called 9-dash line, but nothing more than that. So, this has not restrained China. So Vietnam is always asking India, do more, do more, do more, but nobody is doing more for Vietnam. No country is doing more. And would India do more? That's a huge question. And why would India do more? Now, interestingly, it's very important to read Vietnam's defense white paper of 2019. It says, there are the 4 no's: no to alliances, no to bases, etc. After the 4 no's, there is a caveat, the 5th point that they have raised, that depending on the circumstances and specific conditions, Vietnam will consider developing necessary, appropriate defense. Another 10 minutes, 7 minutes? Is it okay?
Yeah, another 5 to 7.
5 to 7 minutes. Appropriate defense and military relations with other countries. This opens the way for India as a putative counterbalance to China. But not the only one. As I said, there could be others also. Vietnam wants India to take its side on the South China Sea dispute, even without reciprocal support to India on Indian concerns, because it feels that India can give that support. Now, even if Vietnam refrains from pronouncing on India's core concerns, as I said, the consensus on India remains stable. India is still regarded, with its limitations, as a trusted partner of Vietnam. It is of little consequences which party rules Vietnam or India, who the leaders are, because that consensus remains solid and stable. Now, they want India to assume a tougher stance against China's gray zone tactics in the South China Sea, says Zhuang Dung Fan. Stronger statements should reassure Vietnam of India's role in the Indo-Pacific. These are exhortations probably encouraged by the government in the media. And of course, the government, the Vietnamese minister has also said it. The deputy prime minister had said it in India, that India should do more to deal with this problem. But India has been extremely circumspect, because India does not take sides in the South China Sea disputes. We do not support anybody's claim. So Vietnam's former ambassador to India, Pham San Chau, even said that Vietnam would help India extend its reach beyond the Indian Ocean, meaning the Pacific Ocean, if India gave that kind of support. But India has not, did not bite that bait. In my view, Vietnamese leaders should offer an incentive, such as at least commenting favorably on the China-India standoff in Ladakh, if not supporting India. If neither is possible, they should at least facilitate free media discussion, like the media debates on the South China Sea. But none of that is happening, because the Vietnamese are severely pragmatic dealing with India or China. Defense ties, I'll try to wind it up in a few minutes. Defense ties are modest but valuable. Naval exercises, visits, training in fighter aircraft, submarine operations, repair and maintenance of fighter jets, supply and joint manufacturing of naval platforms and imaging. The imaging center is very important in Ho Chi Minh City. It's in the public domain because in Indian satellite data, remote sensing, high resolution photographs are shared with Vietnam. So that's very important. So movement in the South China Sea, it can have a strategic purpose also, though it is meant more for weather and dealing with natural disasters and things like that. But it can have dual purposes, what you're seeing from the sky. Now, this is very interesting that when India signed the Artemis Accords the other day with the Americans, the Artemis Accords, Quad said, the Quad Maritime Domain Awareness Initiative of the Quad Summit 2022 says that all Quad partners will share pictures from satellites to share the data with Southeast Asian and Pacific member states to help track dark shipping and all kinds of things. So that's happening because India has now aligned itself with the Artemis Accords, and all the Quad countries have that, and India has operationalized this center in Vietnam. It is very important. It works at the bilateral level, but it works also at the regional level. So naval platforms and imaging. Then the 12 patrol boats were handed over in June last year, and 7 of them were manufactured in Vietnam. It's interesting. So there is some transfer of technology of the type that India is wanting from the Americans now in defense cooperation. So I mention this because ASEAN generally feels India doesn't deliver on promises. Here is another good example of delivery. Now, but there is no full spectrum defense relationship because India has offered a $500 million credit, but Vietnam wanted to, according to media reports, divert it to civilian uses, and India said no. So the BrahMos missile, yes, on, off, it's been discussed since 2016. I don't know what's happening. India was probably reluctant to go ahead because of concerns about China, but India's policy has definitely changed. But what is Vietnam's policy? I don't know. And Vietnam seems to have put cold water on India's offer to sell Akash missiles, for example. Lastly, political ties. Compared to economy, culture, and defense, political ties are much stronger. Exchanges at the political level, there's less uncertainty about that, but questions remain. Along with Russia and China, India is one of only 3 countries with which Vietnam has a comprehensive strategic partnership. Russia, China, India. But India is lower in the hierarchy compared to Russia and China. I give just 2 or 3 examples. They send vice ministers to national day receptions of India in Hanoi, but not China or Russia. They send ministers. Vietnamese diplomats feel daunted by India's complex tasks and its very hot summer and its severe summer and severe winter. India is only number 5 as a preferred diplomatic destination. So from the Indian side, if there is such a strong political relationship, for 15 years, there was no visit at the Prime Minister level till Prime Minister Modi's visit in 2016. So these are the limitations even in the political relationship. Strong foundations. We should not oversell this relationship. Strong political ties, but modest defense ties and weak economic and cultural links. So what can Vietnam offer India finally? Apart from market access, do economic links matter? Do they stabilize political ties? How much does culture matter? Do Vietnam and India have shared solutions to common threats? Does India's military aid to Vietnam add to Vietnam's strategic capability? Will Vietnam ever consider pronouncing in India's favor against China, which is the biggest problem for India now? The jury is out. I hope you have some answers on this. With multiple claimants to the South China Sea, Vietnam is very well placed to broker its contests within that surrounding the sea and claims surrounding the dispute. With India's trade and hydrocarbon interests, Vietnam as a regional power, and they call themselves now a middle power, many Vietnamese, has cards to drive favorable bargains with a transforming India. We must not underestimate Vietnam's importance to India. But what is the choice before India? Is Vietnam the most important partner in ASEAN? Or is it Singapore? Or is it some other country? I ask you this question and end on this note. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mishra, for that enlightening talk. We have, I think, around 20 odd minutes for question and answers. So any of you want to ask Professor Mishra? Okay, while you think up questions, maybe I'll just
yes, sir.
Pose a question to you on the, what you started off with, the cultural aspect of the ties, and because you talked about the Champas civilization, which I think is not that well remembered in India by in sort of the popular level, but of course amongst professional historians, archaeologists, it does occupy a significant position. So we've seen a little bit of that kind of cultural diplomacy, sort of archaeological support, not just for the charm temples in Vietnam, but also I think I've sort of personally seen some temple restoration happening in Cambodia too, in the sort of Angkor sort of temples. But coupled with that, you also said, how Vietnamese are shocked when they come to India at the sort of absence of sort of Buddhism. But of late, we've been seeing some steps taken by the government to do this, what might be called Buddhist diplomacy, especially in the near neighborhood, particularly Sri Lanka. So do you see any of that, any potential of that kind of diplomacy happening either in Vietnam, but also other Southeast Asian sort of Buddhist nations like Thailand, for example? Or is that not something that the government is thinking about?
Yes, it's a very good question. Again, I point to two different things. One is cultural diplomacy, which is your question. What is the Indian government doing? The Indian government, by the way, has a very conscious policy now of promoting the Buddhist holy sites as tourism centers for the Buddhist population of Southeast Asian countries, Vietnam and others. So therefore, it's something that we have always done. Now, when President Rajendra Prasad visited Vietnam in the 1950s, I don't remember the year, he brought the Bodhi tree. And the Bodhi tree was planted in the oldest pagoda in Hanoi at that point of time. I think I have the data on this. Yes, in 1959, President Rajendra Prasad presented a Bodhi tree to Ho Chi Minh, which was planted at Chan Quoc Pagoda, the oldest Buddhist temple in Hanoi. It is the first Bodhi tree in Vietnam. Now, this is huge. Huge because you are actually renewing a historic at a symbolic level, but the Bodhi tree is so sacred to Buddhism that by planting it, you are really bringing the sacred back to Vietnam from India. Now, the Vietnamese, very interestingly, today there is a revisionist argument. Earlier, the view was that Buddhism came from China, the Mahayana Buddhism, what they call Maha. It came from the north. Along with the onslaught of Chinese culture, the onslaught of Buddhism also came from China. But today, Vietnamese argue that no, Buddhism actually came directly from India, not from China. So there is a desire to rewrite history and to argue against the link, China as a link with Vietnam as far as the coming of Buddhism is concerned into Vietnam. They would prefer to say it was a direct, a movement from India directly. So I don't know whether that's true or not true. I'm not a researcher on that, but you're right, absolutely. There is also the thing about Lumbini. There is a little bit happening between India and Nepal, about Lumbini, the claims. But those days, there were no borders. There was no India. There was no Nepal. So it's the wrong kind of argument anyway. But yes, India is doing that. But the Vietnamese people, they don't understand that Buddhism in India really thrived in the first millennium. And after that, Indian culture changed. In Southeast Asia, the opposite happens in Angkor Wat. The Hindu shrines become Buddhist shrines. The Buddha is installed as the main deity in the Angkor Wat temples. But in India, just the opposite happens. You appropriate Buddhism and you make it, you kind of swallow it up philosophically. And you say, well, Buddhism is Hinduism, so how is it different? And Buddha becomes an avatar of Vishnu. So that's the kind of thing that Vietnamese are shocked. Even the Thais, many Thai friends told me in Bangkok, I lived there for some time. They said, you know what? You Indians killed our Buddha. So I was shocked. I said, we killed your Buddha? Yes, you killed our Buddha. And then they explained what we did. They are more aware of what happened in India, the revival of Hinduism, Shankaracharya and all those things. So this is a very good question. The answer is yes, the Indian government is doing a lot. Because also there is a desire today in India to go indigenous, to go into our roots. The renaming of places, names, and all those things are happening, and to go back to the Mahabharata, to as the origin, as the spirit or the guide to Indian statecraft and those kinds of things. So it's part of that, but I think the impact is still limited unless there are many more flights, much more movement of people. It's just starting now. And there is a very rapidly rising influx of Indian tourists coming into Vietnam, but not Vietnamese tourists going to India. I travel often to Hanoi and I see 90% of the passengers are Indian, both ways, and only 10% are Vietnamese. So
that's a very recent phenomenon, right?
It's a recent
from Delhi to
yes,
other cities to Hanoi.
Yes, they had started these flights before COVID, before 2020. Then they had to put a pause on that, and they have resumed. But the flights are quite full, actually. Yeah. But at least Indians are able to understand Vietnam better now. But they're coming for marriages and these destination weddings and those kinds of things, luxury tourism. Yes, sir.
So, yeah. Do you have a hand? Yeah, go ahead. So please introduce yourself.
Sorry. Thank you for the talk. I'm Bebin. I'm one of the research interns over here.
Yes, sir.
So actually, I had many thoughts in my head when I was listening to your sharing. But one thing I would like to clarify in particular was how you characterized Vietnam's foreign policy thinking as pragmatic when it comes to not wanting to support India's claims because they are afraid of offending the Chinese. So I think what I want to kind of better understand is that how you, in a sense, point out that double standards. I'm not sure if that's offensive to call it a double standard of sorts, where the Vietnamese expect the Indians to step up, but at the same time, they're not willing to help out the Indians. So I'm sure the Vietnamese have thought through this. So could you perhaps elaborate more on why the Vietnamese are willing to hold on to that double standard?
Well, it's simple. I wouldn't call it double standards. I would call it pragmatic statecraft. I don't want to use a value-loaded, as a practitioner, a former practitioner. This is what governments and states always do everywhere. India also does it, playing all sides. The Vietnamese have no choice currently. the defense white paper is very important because before that, they had never spoken of partnerships with other countries. Now they are talking of balancing coalitions because they can't do it alone. They can't do it even with one country. They need a set of countries because the power of China is so overwhelming compared to Vietnam. I mean, India can't do it. The Chinese economy is 5.5 times, 6 times the size of the Indian economy today. If India can't do it, how can Vietnam do it? You know, India with its strength and its size can't do it. So, so I would call it, I use the word severe pragmatism, right? Severely pragmatic. They are more than pragmatic. They're like the Israelis in many ways. I worked in Israel also. The Israelis say we'll work with anybody who's willing to work with us. You know, so the Vietnamese, see, the Vietnamese history or nationalism is defined by being China's other. We got to understand that part of history. It is very deep. It's deeply held. Singapore is very different from Vietnam. Singapore is ethnic majority Chinese. So this is a modern link, and the Chinese here have certain emotional or cultural links with the homeland. I don't know much about Singapore, but I'm sure they do, like the Indian origin people do too. But in Vietnam, there is no such thing, because the Chinese who came to Vietnam, they, you know, intermarriage and all that. There are, in the Cholon region, I have seen in Ho Chi Minh City, there are small Chinese communities, but they're not Chinese, they're Vietnamese. They identify themselves as Vietnamese. And but the modern Vietnamese identity is they see themselves as struggle and cooperation, both. So it's a very complicated approach towards China. We struggle and we cooperate. Many people told me that in the old days, we used to go before the emperor, kowtow before the emperor, give him all the gifts. So we are a tutelary state. China is the middle kingdom, and all the peripheral states are the tutelary states, according to the classical Chinese doctrine of statecraft. We do that, and then we come back home, pick up our guns, and get ready to fight. So this is a very sophisticated, I think a very smart, pragmatic strategy. It is not playing both sides or opportunism. Well, it is opportunism in that sense, but that's how states act. So yeah, I mean, why would Vietnam look at it from their point of view? Why would Vietnam give more to India, knowing very well that India cannot help Vietnam deal with the present and overwhelming pressure from China? India can't. India doesn't have the ability. India's standing in ASEAN is going up a little bit, according to this survey, this year's survey. You know, the military ties, we did recently, I think there was a joint naval exercise with ASEAN for the first time, which was quite significant. And India deployed 2 ships, a task force of 2 ships in the South China Sea in 2021. So there are some incremental increases in capability, but India can't even deal with the Indian Ocean. The Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean is increasing at a very rapid pace. So does India have that ability? No. And why would India do it? What are India's strategic interests in the Pacific? The US wanted India to do much more in the Quad, you know, and that's why AUKUS happened, because India didn't do it. Because we don't have the capacity to deploy in the Pacific. And why would we? We don't have any overwhelming strategic interests, not even in the South China Sea, except oil and gas, to protect our oil and gas interests, which are in any case not very, very large. So therefore, India has to concentrate on the Indian Ocean, and the Americans understand that. And Quad went in a different direction, and that's why ASEAN now is more accepting of Quad. President Jokowi made a statement the other day, the Indonesian chair, the ASEAN. He said that it's okay, you know. So Vietnam also thinks Quad is a good idea. They don't talk about it too much, but they think it's okay, because they are looking for partnerships with the Americans The aircraft carrier, American aircraft carrier visited, I think, one of the ports the other day. And this is not the first time, but they are very coy about stepping it up into some kind of joint interoperability. Whereas they have signed a logistics cooperation agreement with India. The first time they have signed it, such an agreement, very significant last year. So that means their ships, naval ships, can replenish themselves in Indian ports and ours can do in their ports. So there is some increase in India's hard power and capacity to deploy. But what are India's strategic interests? I ask myself, we have to take care of our core interest, which is the Indian Ocean. So Vietnam knows that very well. And for all these reasons, they hedge. They're hedging against China, definitely. But they're also cooperating with China. I would say it is soft hedging and partial hedging and not hard hedging. Yeah.
Right. I think we have time for a couple of questions. Karthik first, and then we might go back to it.
Thank you so much, Karthik Najib, I'm a fellow here at ISAS. Just some quick questions. How many Indians live in Vietnam, and what do they do? Where do they work? What's the
5,500.
I have a few. Sorry, I have a few questions. Yeah.
5,500.
I have a couple. Let me just finish.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the first one.
Yeah.
Second is, what Indian states care about Vietnam? Are they in the Northeast?
Indian states care about Vietnam.
Yeah. Which Indian states care about Vietnam? I presume they probably are in the Northeast somewhere. Is it because they have increased trade and connectivity with the country? And third is, what's the nature of development assistance between the two countries? What kinds of assistance I presume India has provided, and what areas do they go into, whether it's health, climate, or what? Thanks.
Right. The first question, there are 5,500 Indians in Vietnam. And overwhelmingly, they are not just people, they are not Vietnamese of Indian origin. They are Indian citizens mostly, who represent Indian businesses and increasingly businesses of other countries, multinationals and others. They are generally well qualified, upper middle class, well off. And there may be a very small community of Indian traders and businessmen who have been there for a few hundred years, Tamils and others. And the temples in Ho Chi Minh City are testimony to that. So it's not a very significant community with a significant impact. It's not a significant expatriate community. The Indian states caring about Vietnam, I wish they did. The answer is that Indians don't particularly know much about it. They know very little about Vietnam. They only know about Ho Chi Minh and the great struggle against the Americans, the French. As I said, they don't know that Vietnam's real struggle historically has been against the Chinese. With the Americans, if you look at the broader canvas of history, probably history will tell us that the American war, which they call the American war, even the French, will be important episodes, but only episodes. Whereas the war with China is historic in existential, is much deeper. And I think it will remain that way because of geography and because of Chinese expansionism, if I may say so, of which there's so many examples, and recently also. So that's the answer. The Indian state, the Northeastern states are really, we are not even well integrated enough within ourselves. Like Nagaland, mountainous, right? So there are scores of tribes in Nagaland. They speak different languages even today. I went there to give a talk, and they say that we don't understand the language of the other tribe because of the mountains. Because connectivity is limited. And between Nagaland and other states, Manipur, Mizoram, and of course, security problems. So all these things have meant that we haven't had that kind of seamless outreach. So we are trying to do it through Bangladesh.
Bengal as well? Would you?
Bengal, Bangladesh has been very forthcoming, which they weren't when I was there in Dhaka in the 1990s. Today, they are much more forthcoming in giving India transit rights and transportation corridors. both maritime and across land, rail. So we have better connectivity through Bangladesh with the Northeast and with through the Northeast with Myanmar now. The highway with the Myanmar, India-Myanmar, Thailand highway. We just had the Kaladan, I think, multinodal port was open in Myanmar. I think Kaladan port, I think, was recently opened. So things are happening, but the Northeast, Southeast Asia doesn't figure very, Vietnam doesn't figure. I stand corrected. Vietnam doesn't figure in a very major way in the Indian imagination, except nostalgia, history, Nehru, Ho Chi Minh, great struggle, General Giap. But the Vietnamese don't talk about these things today. In contemporary Vietnam, they talk about Ho Chi Minh. He's revered. General Giap is revered. But nobody there, if you try to talk about the war, nobody wants to talk about it. They've moved on. And they don't want to go back to those bitter memories of the past. So that's the second. The other question was developmental assistance. Well, India has language training centers, English language training centers. We have what is called the CMLV countries, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam. So we have given them special assistance, training, IT centers, language training centers, entrepreneurship centers, and a lot of training and scholarships for study in India. Vietnam is one of the major recipients of India's assistance in the knowledge economy, studies and scholarships in India. And but then we don't have many dedicated centers of Vietnam studies or even Southeast Asian studies in India, in Indian universities. Now it's starting more in the private sector. In Vietnam, not a lot on India, but to the extent that they have studies on regarding other countries, India does figure quite prominently, but not a lot. If you see in totality, it's not a lot. I don't have the figures for development assistance, but India has given soft loans. Indian investments are now picking up. Tatas have invested. SR has invested, oil and gas, and ONGC, of course, has invested a lot. But these are private sector initiatives. They are business to business. Government, Vietnam's per capita GDP is higher than India's. So we have to also consider that. And we have a limited capability. So we have to give to those who are in immediate need. So, but Vietnam is a very important partner in that, in development assistance. And Vietnam still views India as a kind of donor. Psychologically, they see India as a donor. But I argued, I gave the counter argument that I don't think it's going to last for very long. If they have overtaken us, if the gap widens, why would they see India as the donor? Like India is not taking developmental aid from anywhere now, aid as opposed to loans. And then defense is very important for India. And these 12 boats that India handed over last year, they were under $100 million defense credit given in 2014. And we offered, as I mentioned, the other $500 million defense credit in 2016. And they have to make up their minds. They wanted to divert it to civilian uses. But I don't think the Indian government, that's what I read in the papers, in the public domain. I don't know. But I don't think they agreed. And they are still talking about it. And India would be interested in definitely selling some defense platforms to Vietnam. The BrahMos missile, probably, I don't know. There are more than whispers in the media now about $600 odd million worth of deals with Indonesia. Imminent, they're talking about it. It's happened with the Philippines. We don't know. We don't know. But Vietnam will also have to keep Chinese sensitivities in mind, because this missile is it's a force multiplier. These are coastal batteries, mostly what the Philippines has got. But even that has a great deterrence value. But then China has been doing much more with our neighboring country. So, so, if India does it, India's time to do it may have come already. I don't know. But Vietnam is a very important developmental partner. That's the short point. Yes, sir. Any other questions? One or two more?
Unfortunately, I think we might have run out of time.
Oh, exactly.
But those like Bibin who have further questions can, of course, talk to Professor Mishra after the formal session ends. You're more than welcome. So I think we'll call the session to an end. Thank you, Professor Mishra, once again for visiting ISAS and throwing some much needed light on India-Vietnam ties. We hope to have you back again sometime in the future. Thank you for being.
Thank you very much.